Number 25. David Berkowitz. Known as the Son of Sam, he carried out a series of shootings around New York City in the summer of 1976. He taunted the police with threats and letters, but was eventually caught. Number 24. Edmund Kemper. Known as the Co-Ed Killer, Kemper's an American serial killer who murdered his grandparents when he was 15. He later killed and dismembered 6 female hitchhikers around Santa Cruz, California, and finally murdered his own mother and her friend before turning himself in. He asked for the death penalty but did not receive it. Number 23. Larry Bittaker and Roy Norris. Nicknamed the Toolbox Killers, these two murdered 5 young women in California in 1979. They lured them into their van and drove them to secluded areas before raping, torturing, and murdering them using a number of tools. Norris eventually testified against Bittaker and was spared the death penalty. Number 22. Ian Brady and Myra Hindley. They killed 5 children between 1963 and 65 in Manchester, England. Their victims were between the ages of 10 and 17 and were sexually assaulted before being brutally murdered. Hindley died in prison, and Brady is still in maximum confinement. Number 21. Kenneth Bianchi and Angelo Buono. In 1978, these two cousins kidnapped, raped, and strangled 10 girls above the hills of Los Angeles, which led to their name, the Hillside Stranglers. Both were sentenced to life in prison. Number 20. Dennis Rader, the BTK Killer. Between 1974 and 1991, he murdered 10 people around Wichita, Kansas. He sent letters to the police under the name BTK, which stood for Bind, Torture, Kill. He disappeared in 1988, but then reemerged in 2005 when he sent a floppy disk to the press. The disk was traced and he was convicted to life in prison. Number 19. Donald Gaskins. In 1969, he began picking up and torturing hitchhikers on highways in the American South. He later claimed that he killed 80 to 90 people. He was eventually caught and put on death row, and he then went on to commit a further murder in the high-security prison, becoming the only man to have ever killed an inmate on death row. Number 18. Peter Manuel. An American-born Scottish serial killer, he murdered 9 people across southern Scotland between 1956 and 1958. He was caught after he paid with banknotes taken from one of the victims and was one of the last prisoners to be hanged in Scotland before the abolition of capital punishment. Number 17. John George Hay. Known as the acid bath murderer, he would charm wealthy individuals into believing that he was a successful businessman. He would then lure them to a warehouse and shoot them, after which he dissolved their bodies in sulfuric acid. He was hanged at Wandsworth Prison. Number 16. Fred and Rose West. Between 1967 and 1987, Fred West and his wife Rose tortured, raped, and killed at least 11 young girls at their home in Gloucester, which was later nicknamed the House of Horrors. After being caught, Fred hung himself in his prison cell. Their house was also demolished to discourage souvenir hunters. Number 15. Arthur Shawcross. Known as the Genesee River Killer, Shawcross was initially imprisoned for raping and killing an 8-year-old girl. He was released, however, and went on to brutally kill 12 prostitutes. He was sentenced to 250 years but died of heart failure in 2008. Number 14. Peter Sutcliffe. Known as the Yorkshire Ripper, he was convicted of murdering 13 women around Leeds in northern England. He was caught for driving with false number plates and eventually sentenced to life in prison. Number 13. Richard Ramirez. An American serial killer and Satan worshipper, he terrorized Los Angeles between 1984 and 1985. Nicknamed the Night Stalker, he broke into homes, shooting, stabbing, raping, and mutilating his victims. He was sentenced to death but died in prison in June of 2013. Number 12. Jeffrey Dahmer. Known as the Milwaukee Cannibal, Dahmer raped, murdered, and dismembered 17 men and boys between 1978 and 1991. He also exhibited necrophilia in 8 parts of his later victims. He was eventually caught when a would-be victim overpowered him, and not long after that he was beaten to death by a fellow inmate at the Columbia Correctional Institution. Number 11. Dennis Nilsen. The British equivalent of Jeffrey Dahmer, Nilsen murdered 15 men at his home in London between 1978 and 1983. He dissected their bodies and flushed their remains down the toilet. When human flesh was discovered in the sewer system, this led to his arrest. He is still being held at Full Sutton Maximum Security Prison in Yorkshire, England. Number 10. Ted Bundy. One of the most widely known murderers of the 20th century, Ted killed numerous women in the 1970s. He typically lured his victims into secluded places before raping and killing them. He kept at least 12 decapitated heads in his apartment as trophies, and he managed to escape police custody twice but was eventually executed in Florida. Number 9. Charles Ng and Leonard Lake. Believed to have raped and killed 25 victims in Calaveras County, California, they filmed themselves raping and torturing them. Their crimes eventually came to light after Lake committed suicide and Ng was caught shoplifting. He tried to flee to Canada but was eventually returned to the U.S. and put on death row. Number 8. John Wayne Gacy. Gacy sexually assaulted and murdered 33 young men between 1972 and 1978 around Chicago, Illinois. He lured them to his home before strangling them and spent 14 years on death row before being executed in 1994. Number 7. Andrei Chikatilo. This Soviet serial killer, nicknamed the Butcher of Rostov, raped, murdered, and mutilated at least 52 women in Russia between 1978 and 1990. He was caught after police suspected him and conducted surveillance. He was then executed by firing squad 2 years later. Number 6. Tommy Lynn Sells. Claiming to have killed 70 people, Sells was eventually captured after breaking into the bedroom of a 10-year-old girl, stabbing her, and leaving her for dead. She survived and managed to alert the neighbors. He was sentenced to death in Livingston, Texas. Number 5. Gary Ridgway. Having been convicted of 49 murders throughout Washington state, he managed to avoid the death penalty after giving detailed confessions of his crimes. Number 4. Pedro Rodriguez Filho. Committing his first murder at the age of 14, he started out by killing local drug dealers in his Brazilian neighborhood to avenge his girlfriend who was killed while he was in prison. He was eventually caught and sent back to prison where he killed his father, who was also there for murder. He went on to kill 47 more inmates while in prison. Number 3. Daniel Camargo Barbosa. This Colombian serial killer is believed to have raped and murdered over 80 girls in Colombia in the 70s and 80s. He was captured, and after his escape, he went on to kill 70 more girls in Ecuador. After raping them, he would hack them apart with a machete. He was eventually sentenced to 16 years in prison, which is the maximum allowed in Ecuador. He was then murdered by a relative of one of his victims while in prison. Number 2. Dr. Harold Shipman. One of the most prolific serial killers in recorded history, this English doctor is said to be responsible for up to 250 murders. It was eventually discovered that he was poisoning his patients and forging their wills. He hung himself in prison in 2004. And number 1. Pedro Alonso Lopez. This Colombian serial killer is accused of raping and killing over 300 girls across South America. He was arrested when an attempted abduction failed and he was trapped by market traders. He confessed, but police only believed him when a flash flood uncovered a mass grave containing many of his victims. If you liked the video you just saw, then feel free to subscribe to our YouTube channel by using the orange button in the top right. And don't forget to go check out our website at list25.com for more awesome lists.